Well, now let us unpack the latest in the conflict in the Middle East with our team of experts here at the BBC. With me in the studio are Chief International Correspondent Lyse Doucet and Security Brief's Mikey Kay, a former senior officer and assault helicopter pilot with the British military. We're also going to be joined by Siyavesh Ardalan from BBC Persian, part of the BBC World Service, and joining us also our World Affairs editor John Simpson, our correspondent Mark Lowen in Tel Aviv, and from Washington our Chief North America correspondent Gary O'Donoghue. Let me begin with you, Lyse. In terms of where we are today, it is momentous that the US has struck in Iran. What are the potential consequences that are playing out and the questions being asked in the region as you're seeing right now?
This is a major turning point in the 45-year-old standoff between Iran and the United States of America. There have been many decades of heightened tension, but never has there been a direct military strike by the United States on Iranian territory. As Iran's foreign minister described it, they have crossed a red line. Many would say that as tensions rose across the region, it may have just been a matter of time. But this certainly puts this tension into a whole new terrain, which is very, very unpredictable and very, very perilous. And what will determine the next course of action, of course, is going to be how Iran chooses to respond. It is a war of words as well as an escalating war on the ground. Iranians are being very defiant and saying that they will respond, but they have so few options. The supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, who has spent the decades that he's been had the final say in Iran since 1989, has always acted with great caution. He's also used what the Iranians call strategic patience, playing the long game. That game is up. If he does too little, he will lose face. If he does too much, he will lose everything.
John Simpson, can I bring you in? Because there have been comparisons made by some with the events in Iraq. Do you think that is a parallel, or do you think this is a very defined and different case?
I think it is a different case. And you have to remember that it seems to have happened quite fast. It's only, I think, 10 days since the US State Department was saying, well, Israel is doing what it wants to do in Iran, nothing to do with us, the United States. And that has, of course, utterly changed. It's been turned right on its head, that policy. And the speed with which it's done is something which I think will cause a good deal of nervousness around, well, particularly Donald Trump's allies and friends, Britain, France, Germany, and so on. They'll be nervous that such a big change can happen so fast. I mean, there's two possibilities here. One is that Israel, with American help, strong American help, destroys the Iranian nuclear program altogether, which cannot be absolutely guaranteed. And secondly, that they negotiate an end to it willingly on Iran's part. Well, if that happened, if that was ever going to happen, it's now a long way in the past.
OK. Mikey Kay, we heard Pete Hegseth, the US Defence Secretary, give a briefing. Did we learn anything specifically new from that? We also heard from the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the US.
Yeah, I would say with Pete Hegseth, sort of the usual flamboyant praises for Donald Trump. With the Joint Chiefs, General Dan Kane, some really, really useful information on that. Definitely more nuanced. Joint Chiefs was talking about severely degrading over destroying. I think that's an important factor, because without the accurate bomb damage assessments, the BDAs that the Joint Chiefs have said that they're still working on, and I don't think you'll ever get a full BDA bomb damage assessment on those strikes, because obviously they're trying to strike something underground. We don't know what was in there before they were struck, so we don't know, the consequences of the damage, and therefore we don't know what Iran's ultimate ability will be to continue its program, whether it's in a peaceful guise or whether it's enriching uranium to 60%, which is what the IAEA report came up with. So, yes, definitely some interesting sound bites from the Joint Chiefs. The bit that I'd like to focus on, though, is one of the journalists asked him about force protection, and he said he didn't want to comment upon force protection. I just sort of want to build that out a little bit on what that means. Force protection is basically the way that, and the context was US forces deployed in the Middle East region, of which there are about 40 to 50,000 based all over. Force protection basically means measures put in place to protect those from any form of response from Iran. You just spoke about, we don't know what the courses of action are for Iran, but that will be certainly in that list of contingency planning. And force protection around those bases could involve systems called THAAD, which is Terminal High Altitude Area Defense. They're basically interceptor missiles that can go quite high, backed up by Patriot. And then around bases, you have what's called a close-in weapon system called Phalanx. And that basically is a inner defense mechanism that is used to target unguided rockets or mortars or lighter projectiles. So when the Joint Chiefs is talking about force protection, that's likely what he's talking about, making sure that, you know, those areas of interest that could be on a potential target set for Iran are defended. Now, the interesting bit for me, and when it comes to talking force protection, is we've also got Royal Air Force Akrotiri, which is on the southern tip of Cyprus. That doesn't have much force protection. It doesn't come under the umbrella of the Iron Dome, David Sling, or Arrow 2 and 3 interceptors that operate out of Israel. And it certainly won't, at the moment, have Patriots or THAAD there as well. So I think that's an interesting piece in terms of risk, especially for the UK Prime Minister. What operates out of Royal Air Force Akrotiri, you've got US-wise, you've got the U-2 strategic intelligence aircraft. That's been operating out of there for years. That's the eyes and ears, if you like, over the Middle East. So that's something that's key. But yeah, lots of useful information from the Joint Chiefs.
Let me just bring in, we have had a couple of questions in. One person asking what type of bombs were used, but also, if I can bring you in, Gary O'Donoghue, our chief North America correspondent, a very basic question in a way. Why did Trump bomb Iran?
Well, why did he do it? Well, he made a choice after a week or so, 9 days of Israel attacking Iran. He believed, by the look of it, that the Iranians were stonewalling on negotiations, and we certainly saw a bit of that in Geneva at the end of the week, when the Iranian foreign minister really wasn't sort of coming anywhere near the idea of coming back to negotiations before the bombing had stopped. And I think the president and his team, his National Security Council, saw an opportunity where, as things stand, Iran is at its weakest moment. Its militias in the region have been absolutely decimated, degraded, hugely degraded. Its missile stocks have been depleted as well. And so two of the big sort of levers it can pull are much less effective right now. Now, there still are other things it could do. They often talk here about missiles, militias, and terrorism, as they put it. So there's sort of forms of asymmetric warfare that they could employ, soft targets, targeting less protected bases in the region, as Mikey has been talked about. I think that's exactly what they did after they killed Soleimani at the end of the previous administration. And interestingly, at that point in time, bear in mind, there was some response from Iran, but it was kind of tokenistic. They hit a couple of bases, I think one in Jordan, one in Iraq, and it all kind of faded away after that. Now, whether or not that's an option this time around on the scale of this, I very much doubt. But everyone is waiting here to see what the response will be, because the key thing when it comes to America is that public opinion matters. It can make a situation incredibly difficult for a president who gets on the wrong side of public opinion. Donald Trump cares about public opinion, and he cares about his legacy. And if this turns into something that spirals out of control, draws him further and further in, then that is somewhere he doesn't want to be, and somewhere he promised not to be when he campaigned for the presidency last year.
Okay, and before I bring in some more specific questions from our audience who've been sending them in, do get in touch if you've got more questions. We'd love to hear from you. But can I just go back to John Simpson, our World Affairs editor, because this does feel like quite a moment, and I just wondered where you think we are. How does it rank in Middle East and global tensions overall on a world view going back decades, as you have that experience?
Well, it is a very big moment. I mean, whether it's second, third, first, hard to say, but it is a big, big moment because the United States has got involved in a war with Iran, which is, you could say, the biggest power in its particular region, with tentacles that go out right across the entire region. And for the US to get its hands dirty, to start dropping bombs on a country like Iran is very important. You do have to remember that the Americans believe, and it's not only the Americans, that Iran is very much a paper tiger. It doesn't have the kind of abilities that often people assume that it does. I mean, it was very significant, I think, that the American bombers were able to carry out their mission without any kind of resistance whatsoever. Very significant that Israeli planes have been flying at will right across Iran. Iran is not the kind of power that is able to do that. But as Gary O'Donoghue was saying, there is, of course, the different types of warfare which are perfectly possible, that a group of people, 5, 7 people, could go and attack an American base somewhere, or a British base, or anything. This is not a major kind of attack, but it's the kind of thing that Iran has tended to do in the past. So it fits in some ways with a kind of tradition that's been established almost ever since the revolution in Iran in 1979. But nevertheless, this is a considerable upgrading of it.
And let me just bring in a question from Vivian Powis, Lyse, if I can ask you. She says, has anyone asked about Iranian casualties? I doubt Iranians working in these places were thrilled to be doing so. How many will not return to their families today? Any estimates?
We've been having a very hard time, Geeta, finding out, even before the US intervened militarily, what kind of casualties Iran was sustaining. Earlier in the Israeli operations, there was reports that more than 500 had been killed, many, many more injured. We simply haven't been able to confirm. We don't have our own people on the ground yet, and we don't know how much information Iran is giving out. Have the scientists who were working in those sites been moved out? I would imagine they did move out. There had been reports earlier they would be taking protective measures because it's not a reactor, so there's not as much of a risk there is no risk of radiation. They were enriching there, but so we just don't know. We don't know.
And Mark Lowe, in a question from Vito Fiume in Italy, who says, as we witness the painful consequences of Israel's campaigns in Gaza, how can the US support for Israel be so unwavering to become militarily involved in Iran as Netanyahu wanted? Obviously, that's a very political question, but the alliance between the US and Israel goes back decades, and it crosses politics, doesn't it, and political leaders, in fact.
It does. I mean, America is clearly Israel's most important ally internationally, and yet that alliance has been under severe strain since the 7th of October attacks that prompted Israel's massive military retaliation in Gaza, particularly under the previous American administration of Joe Biden. It was really showing the strain with a real kind of quite public falling out quite often between Joe Biden and Benjamin Netanyahu. They would give joint press conferences in which the Israelis would publicly go against the Americans and sort of ignore instructions really to try to rein in the operation in Gaza. Then in came Donald Trump, who Benjamin Netanyahu has called Israel's greatest ever friend in the White House. Remember, in his first term, he was the American president who moved the American embassy from here in Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, recognizing Jerusalem as the Israeli capital, something which the Palestinians dispute. He was somebody who led the Abraham Accords, as they were known, normalizing Israel's relationship with various Arab allies. The one country that it has not got a normal relation with, normalized relation with yet, the big prize, is Saudi Arabia, which has said it will only get that, it will only normalise relations with Israel once the Palestinians are given a proper state. So all of that to say that Trump has kind of repaired the relationship, which took quite a hit over Gaza during the Biden administration, and now with America joining Israel's military operations in Iran, Donald Trump has shown once again that he is willing to absolutely throw the weight of US military support behind Israel and behind Israel's assessment of the Iranian threat, which I have to say can and has stood in contrast to some Western intelligence agencies' assessment of how close Iran is to a nuclear weapon.
Yeah, and that is a key question, wasn't it? Whether development was imminent or not, because that's partly the grounds for legality. John Simpson, just again a wider question. Todd Pridgeon asks, to what extent is it believed that Russia or China will help Iran behind the scenes? They have both put out statements condemning the attack by the US, but what's your assessment there in terms of this broadening?
Well, we haven't had a full Russian response to these latest attacks. But the interesting thing is that Russia's very much the dog that didn't bark in the night. If you recall, Russia, of course, has been, not so much now, but has been very dependent on Iran for drones in its war on Ukraine. It has been really quite close to Iran at times. But when Putin talked about the current state of the relationship between America and Israel and Iran, he advised Iran to carry on talking with President Trump. He didn't say, as you might have expected, this is an outrageous attack, or at least he hasn't said that yet. What he seemed to want to do, at least until the attacks took place, was to go back or get the other two sides back to the negotiating table. That is really important because it shows, I think, that he's still, up until perhaps a few hours ago, certainly wanted to have as good a relationship with Donald Trump as it's possible to get. As for China, the Chinese have been extremely keen to distance themselves from all of this, distance themselves to some extent from Russia over its current approach in Ukraine, rather standing back and watching, not being unfriendly, not being critical in any way, but certainly not supportive. So you've got up till now, and I have to say that because it could change, but up to now you've got both Russia and China standing on the sidelines, watching, no doubt having their own thoughts about it, but not getting involved in any way.
OK. A question from Paul Hill for you, Mikey. He asks about whether we know whether the US military has obliterated, in inverted commas, Iran's nuclear capability. As you said earlier, we don't know yet, do we? But he also says, how might Tehran retaliate? Because that is obviously the key question for the next steps.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've got two potential options here. You've got in a conventional way, which means using ballistic missiles. It has got what's called a Fatah-2 hypersonic missile, which has a hypersonic glide vehicle around the warhead. Basically, when the warhead separates from the rocket itself at very high altitude, that hypersonic glide vehicle then has the ability to turn, and so it makes it harder to intercept. So those would be quite a potent threat on potential US bases, for example, around the region. So you've got those sort of that conventional response, and then you've got sort of the asymmetric, unconventional response. As we were talking about earlier, you know, Iran does have a lot of associates and proxies in the region. It's got the Popular Mobilization Forces in Iraq. It had Bashar al-Assad's forces prior to his toppling. It used to have Hezbollah until that was degraded by Israel, and then obviously there's the Houthis in Yemen. So I don't think we should underestimate Iran's ability to influence or respond asymmetrically if it was forced to do that. So a number of different courses of action that I'm sure the Iranian strategic planners will be looking at.
And Lyse, in a way, well, another question that was linked to that, really, Dave Keeley says the Iranians are likely to be dispersing their uranium stockpiles rather than let it be destroyed. We don't know, of course, what's been happening. If the government collapses under the pressure of what's happening, do we know where it is or how we stop it falling into the wrong hands in the ensuing chaos? Now, there's a lot of ifs there because we don't know if the regime will collapse. And Pete Hegseth has just said this was a targeted, focused operation on the nuclear facilities, not regime change.
Yes, he was very much asked, in fact, right from the get-go at that press briefing, he was asked, is this about regime change? And he goes, this is not about regime change. Powerful, clear, direct. It is only about the nuclear facilities. But of course, the messaging has changed with almost every day, both from President Trump and from the United States. Even though in the Israeli attacks of the last 10 days, they have wiped out most of the upper echelons of the security establishment in Iran, both in terms of conventional military forces as well as the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. But the IRGC is still attacked. It's still thousands strong. There's still the volunteers as well. The supreme leader is said to be, he's ailing, 86 years old, but he's in a bunker.
But his name's successors, hasn't he?
Well, yes, the body which is the body whose sole task it is to choose a new supreme leader has been activated just in case. So they're getting ready. He's also gone down the chain of command and saying if this one's eliminated, this will be this one. It is possible it could all collapse. This is taking, it could take directions that no one can say with any certainty. But for now, regime change is not on the agenda. All of the indications we have is that the regime is not on the run. They're not heading for the border. They're still there, weakened, but still defiant.
OK, well, of course, there are a lot more questions coming in, including on what is going on with the nuclear material, because we still don't know exactly what the assessment is of the damage that has been done by these strikes and whether there will be any further action. But we heard some clear updates from the US in that briefing on the latest. This is BBC News. Well, we are going to continue, and I just want to follow up on the sort of internal events in Iran. And I know it's difficult, Lyse, to track exactly what's coming out. The internet's been down. We've been obviously trying to hear from people within the country as well. But in terms of their political succession, or how weak the regime is it possible to assess that at the moment? Because we know that obviously Israel's been remarkably successful, hasn't it, in terms of attacking Hamas, Hezbollah, and these very precision strikes in recent weeks and months within Iran. So a lot of concerns from Iran's point of view about their security, and now we see the US obviously getting involved in a huge way too.
Oh, well, bear in mind that this is a very, very long-running confrontation, that Iran has been suffering under sanctions for many, many years. President Trump, once he pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal in 2018, has been slapping more and more sanctions on Iran, so they're weak economically, and that has had a huge impact on the population. There are protests all the time in Iran, sometimes against power shortages, sometimes against water shortages, sometimes against the clerical rule. 2022, 2023 were unprecedented protests which racked Iran. They caused cracks, of course, in the structure of the Islamic Republic, but they didn't bring it down. But what we have seen now with these attacks by Israel is that the population, whether or not they support the government or not, are terrified, and they've been on the run, and they're very, very angry that this is not about nuclear facilities. They too are suffering. So the regime is weakened. It is also weakened militarily. What you mentioned, what Iran used to call its ring of fire, its axis of resistance, its forward defences across the region have been completely wiped out in some cases. Hezbollah, there were reports that the supreme leader wanted Hezbollah to react. There's no sign of that yet. The militias in Iraq, the militias in Syria no longer have any strength. The Houthis are one of the only ones which are still retaliating, and we'll wait and see what they do, because they have threatened to do so. And yes, the air defences, although they still are operating in Tehran to a certain extent, as well as in some other cities, but Iran is very, very exposed militarily right now. But when you ask officials about that, they talk about resistance, what John Simpson was mentioning before. But this kind of even this asymmetric warfare now is very, very dangerous from Iran. I think anything Iran does, no matter how limited, no matter how calibrated, will trigger a response.
And John Simpson, just bringing you in there, a question from Babak Moomin. Have we heard any more from Raza Pahlavi from the ex-royal family and his plans to help Iran transition away from the regime towards a secular democracy?
Well, he's been putting out statements, certainly, critical, naturally, of the regime in Tehran. The fact is that the opposition to the Ayatollahs is really deeply fractured. There is no obvious, natural kind of alternative to their rule, simply because there is so much disagreement about what kind of government should follow. So there's no natural sort of opposition group that can just simply walk in and take over power. And this has been the big problem for opposition people in Iran, and really the big achievement and the big gift to Ayatollah Khamenei and his regime. There is no strong alternative. Each individual grouping will tell you that they're strong enough to take over, but that doesn't seem to be the case at the moment. And really, it seems to me that unless there is some kind of change of regime in Iran, then there can be no solution to the particularly to the nuclear question.
OK, John Simpson, thank you very much indeed. You are with BBC News as we continue our special coverage asking your questions on the current conflict in the Middle East. Let me just continue that thought, John, if I can. And I'm going to put the same question to you, Gary O'Donoghue, in the US. Is it known, even privately, discreetly, how much there has been Western support for Iran opposition figures, and whether any of those groups would be able to step in any sort of meaningful way if this regime did ultimately collapse?
There's been no strong, clear support in Britain, France, the United States, Germany. Those are the countries I know about, I think, for the very reason that there isn't an obvious alternative. So that it's very difficult to give too much support. I'm sure that privately, quietly, the intelligence services of all those countries are watching each of the different groups, but no strong support, certainly no big financial support or anything remotely like it.
And Gary O'Donoghue, anything on that in terms of, is there a sense that there has been longer term planning from the US?
No, there's no sense of that whatsoever here. And the focus has been very much on other issues. And of course, the CIA and other agencies here has a pretty checkered history in trying to involve itself in those kinds of operations in foreign climates. It's not always worked terribly well in South America and elsewhere. So I think that's something they would be very reluctant to be involved with. Having said all that, you know, Donald Trump, they may be insisting now that they're not interested in regime change, but Donald Trump did say when he was at the G7 summit, you know, we know where you are, Supreme Leader. We're not coming after you for the time being. So they are sort of mixing up the messaging on the question of regime change, but certainly no one has ever envisaged publicly what would come afterwards. And of course, you know, you have to look at some potential parallels. You know, the breakup of the Soviet Union 45 years after the end of the Second World War, and here we are 45 years after the Islamic Revolution, led to a period in the 90s in the Soviet Union of absolute chaos, of anarchy, economic anarchy, these sort of effectively competing economic warlords, and people will, I think, certainly be fearing that if the Islamic regime collapsed, you could get that kind of anarchy. And of course, you know, Iran is not a unified country in terms of ethnic groupings either. There are Persians, but there are Arabs and there are Azeris and there are others as well. And all that conflict, you know, in combination with the pressure from the outside, that implosion, could lead to years of instability in a region that is already incredibly unstable.
And Mark Lowen, in Israel, what does that mean there? That we know that the public have supported to a degree what Netanyahu is doing, seeing Iran as an existential threat, as the government puts it. How does that feel where you are today?
Yeah, I mean, a poll came out about 3 days ago, Geeta, showing that 70% of Israelis support the war against Iran. More Israeli Jews, I have to say, than Israeli Arabs. And that is compared, for example, to the majority of Israelis who now want the war in Gaza to come to an end and want a ceasefire there to bring the Israeli hostages back. But even though they support basically crushing the Iranian nuclear threat, I think there is a recognition here as well that, as John and as Lyse and Gary were saying, there is no obvious opposition to take over in a country of 90 million people. And that is there's a real risk there that it could descend into the kind of chaos that we saw in Libya, in Iraq, as those despots fell. I mean, a couple of points to make here, I think. Raza Pahlavi, who we were mentioning and who John was talking about, the crown prince, the son of the former Shah, he is in exile and he is kind of the most active opposition figure, but he is also pretty close to Benjamin Netanyahu. And so I think even though he is, you know, presenting himself as a potential opposition candidate in waiting, I think that there would be a lot of Iranians who would be loath to support somebody who they would see somehow as the puppet of the aggressor. So I think he would stand not a brilliant chance, to be frank, of uniting Iranians behind him. And you know, as John was alluding to, there are, as Gary was alluding to, there are also, you know, the Kurds and the other ethnic groups as well in Iran who will not necessarily rally around him. And also, Israel has shown itself to be completely, or to not really have thought at all about the day after in Gaza over the last 20 months. It has been pursuing the war in Gaza with more than 55,000 people dead there, according to the local health officials, saying it wants to completely obliterate Hamas without really presenting a cogent view of who would take over in Gaza. And many critics of Netanyahu are saying that really he is committing the same error potentially with Iran, with his defense minister saying, you know, it is time to undermine the regime in Tehran. Fine, but what comes next? And that is still a big looming question.
Absolutely. And just to let everyone know, Reuters is reporting that the UN Security Council is going to meet later today, Sunday, over the US strikes on Iran. And just a couple of questions, Mikey Kay, our security expert. Andrew Marriott from Tunbridge Wells has said, what level of firepower does Iran actually have left to cause damage to Israel in particular? Charlotte Rankin asks, if Iran was to retaliate and target allies, US allies, for example, the UK, how would they do this? Will this conflict increase the terror risk?
Yeah, lots to unpack in that question. I think, you know, there's no doubt that Iran's forces have been degraded, severely degraded from the air component. Hence the reason for the GBU-57 strike and how those packages could get close. I think the big unknown is Iran's ballistic missile capability, and I think one of the big questions that IDF strategic military planners will be looking at is what their stockpiles to be able to refill their three-tiered layered defense system, which is Iron Dome, Inner Circle, David Sling, Intermediary, and Arrow 2 and 3, which go out beyond 2,000 kilometers. So I think that's going to certainly be a big question, is how much and how effective is Iran's ballistic missile capability? Now, the IDF have been degrading those sites for months now, going back to last year as well. Iran does require help from other nations in order to build those ballistic missiles. So it gets its engines from North Korea, for example, and it gets something called a chemical called sodium perchlorate, which is turned into ammonium perchlorate. That comes from China. That is used in the solid fuel propellant for ballistic missiles. And then it goes back to, so that's sort of more of a conventional response. That conventional response could be used on sort of anywhere really in the Middle East, US bases, particularly US bases, I think. You have US bases in Qatar. You've got the Combined Air Operations Center, Al-Udeid. You've got about 100 aircraft assets there. You've got US naval facility in Bahrain. And you've got places all over. The interesting bit from the UK is Royal Air Force Akrotiri in southern Cyprus. That's been a forward-basing strategic asset for the UK for many years. I was stationed out there in the late 90s. And it's incredibly useful for the UK. So Operation Shader, which is Typhoons that have been operating out of RAF Akrotiri in the fight against so-called Islamic State in northeastern Syria. They've been doing that for a long time. That operation's coming to a close, if not closed already. You've got a Shadow R1 reconnaissance aircraft, which is UK-based, that has actually been doing reconnaissance missions over Gaza and over Israel. The UK government is saying it's there to try and identify where the hostages are. But that aircraft does have a significant capability of that. And then you've got the U-2 strategic intelligence aircraft, and that's been operating out of RAF Akrotiri since I was there for over 30 years. That paints the picture in the Middle East. So, yeah, conventional and then asymmetric, as Lyse was talking about earlier.
Mikey, thanks very much for that. Let me bring in Siavash Ardalan now from BBC Persian. And Siavash, just give me an overview on what the responses that you've been seeing are from any citizens within Iran today, but other sources too.
Typically, the public opinion in Iran is very divided, as it has been since the first day that Israel launched its attacks. On one hand, you have people who are very supportive of the government, obviously and predictably. They would be very much opposed to Israel's attack and would expect the Iranian regime to fight on. And then you have the second group of people who are opposed to the regime, critical, and even some political prisoners who, as much as they don't like the regime, but they equally despise the Israeli government and have condemned the attacks by Israel on Iran, trying to make a difference, trying to differentiate between the enemy within and the enemy of without, and arguing basically that if the regime in Iran is to be changed or toppled, it has to be at the hands of the people. And then you have another group of people in Iran, and also represented by the hardline exiled community, especially the monarchists, as you were talking about, who are happy about the attacks because they are resentful of what the regime has done. Many of those top military commanders that were killed in the Israeli attack were people involved in some of those crackdowns in the past on internal dissent. The opposition groups are hoping that these attacks can somehow trigger an internal revolt against the regime. Therefore, they see it as an opportunity, as they have said in some of the statements issued by the exiled opposition figures. And that's pretty much what's also the kind of discourse that we're seeing, internal conversations among Iranians themselves.
And Siavash, is there any information that is reliable on the damage that's been done to these three bases, whether the nuclear material was there, whether it had been moved, how badly it's been damaged? Because those are all key questions.
Well, if we want to be completely objective, it's just at the moment it's a war of narratives unless some documents are provided about the level of the damage that has been inflicted by the Americans. Key nuclear center that was damaged was Fordow. I think that's the center of attention. Iranians are so far downplaying the damage. Iranian state TV just sent out a reporter this morning to the site where you could see in the videos, you could see some smoke coming up, but trying to downplay the damage and saying basically the entrance points to the Fordow nuclear facility have been damaged, not the facility itself. So not denying the attack, but downplaying the extent of the damage. I've also seen some people who have agreed with that assessment, some scholars outside Iran as well. But more importantly, Iran has said that it has moved all the critical material. Even before the US attacks, Iranians said that they have moved all the critical material from Fordow to other places. perhaps making a reference to the fact that Iran already has the know-how to enrich uranium and has the know-how eventually to build a bomb. So whether Iran can rebuild, how long it will take to rebuild, it all depends on the damage and on whether the human capital, the knowledge, the scientists involved in these kinds of ventures, where they are and how much they've been targeted by Israel. Because as we know, in this 9-day campaign, by military campaign by Israel, there's been a lot of assassinations carried out by Israel's domestic agents against some of these nuclear scientists who have been shot down or taken out in different parts of Iran.
Okay, and let me bring in John Simpson too with a wider question, if I can. Brenda Tenton asks, will the Russians come in on the side of Iran? We have touched on the Russian position to a degree, but a question that you see on social media a lot at the moment, are we on the brink of a world war?
Well, you know, if this was July 1914, I suspect a lot of us would say, no, it won't happen. It'll, you know, something will come up. But we know very well that big wars can start from relatively small affairs and turn into something really bad. And that must be always a possibility. The fact is that Russia is clearly very, very nervous about any kind of nuclear warfare. It says again and again there's a danger in the Ukraine war that it could turn nuclear, but that's often said for kind of propagandistic reasons. Doesn't look in the slightest as though Vladimir Putin would risk a nuclear war, because he knows, I mean, he must have seen now another example of America's military might. He knows that Russia would be wiped out in a nuclear war. So it would be absolutely impossible, really, to go into one thinking that he might win it. And therefore, you can trust, I think, Vladimir Putin to stand back from it to some extent. He doesn't want to get in too deep. He doesn't want the Americans to get in too deep. He's hoping that this will, if not go away, that it will simply turn into an embarrassment for the Americans, which he can then exploit. But I don't think we're facing a nuclear war. I really don't think so. But, you know, it's been possible to make so many mistakes about that kind of thing in the past.
And John, what about China, and what are the ways that you see this potentially unfolding? Because obviously we also have the Gulf states. Donald Trump has reached out to the Saudis very strongly since he returned to office. What are the options for where this goes now?
Well, I mean, let's just deal with China first of all. China's absolutely constant concern is to maintain the stability of the Chinese Communist Party in power. It will not do anything that might risk some kind of upheaval, social or even worse, some kind of military upheaval in China. That is absolute anathema to the Chinese leadership. All they want is to just carry on as they are, making money and extending their influence. So whatever China does will always be directed against any kind of warfare. Other countries, well, Saudi Arabia has a tremendous card to play in the whole area because at the moment it's refusing to have any kind of serious relationship with Israel on the grounds that there is no two-state solution yet. Perhaps never will be, but that's what Saudi Arabia would like to happen. And until there's some sort of progress there, which could be a very, very long way away, Saudi Arabia simply won't get involved with Israel. Might not have an outwardly hostile relationship with Israel, but it certainly wouldn't have anything remotely like a friendly relationship. Israel can live with that. It doesn't need Saudi Arabia's agreement, friendship, treaties, anything like that. But as long as nobody else gets involved, that's all that Israel cares about.
And Siavash, let me ask you a question from Paul Heppelston, who says, why is Iran forbidden to have or develop nuclear power or weapons by countries that already have these capabilities? It seems a very unreasonable demand. Quotes, yes, we've got it, but you, Iran, can't have it. And a more fundamental question that, again, we've seen being asked a lot is fundamentally, why is this conflict happening at all between Israel and Iran?
Well, it's noteworthy that Iran has been a member of NPT, has obliged by NPT, and is not a nuclear state at present. I think one of the biggest mistakes that the Supreme Leader will think he has made, one of his biggest, in his opinion, wrong decisions, is to not go for the nuclear bomb when he is facing two foes who are both nuclear states, the U.S. and Israel. I think one of the reasons why the international community has been so sensitive and has felt so threatened by the possibility or the ability for Iran to develop a nuclear weapon is its posture, is its foreign policy stance. From the very first day of the 1979 revolution, Iran has called for the destruction of Israel. It has not recognized Israel as a state. It's one of its, cornerstone of its foreign policy has been to eliminate Israel. Sometimes on some of these ballistic missiles that they parade, they write Israel should be destroyed. And I think the argument is, at least from the Israeli side, when you have a country that threatens you with destruction and has the capacity to develop nuclear weapons, then you should feel threatened. And that's why I think is the argument that Iran in particular should be stopped from developing nuclear weapons. Whereas if it was Iran before the revolution, where under the Shah, where it was an ally of the West and had very close relationships with Israel, maybe there wouldn't be such sensitivity about Iran having a nuclear weapon.
And have you seen reporting as to how Iran is considering retaliating?
Well, there are different options. It wouldn't be any kind of retaliation that would take the Americans or the Israelis by surprise. It's either attacking U.S. military bases. The Revolutionary Guard had issued a statement saying, we have identified those flight paths and the locations where those flights, U.S. flights, took off. And they said that the military bases, U.S. military bases in the region are vulnerable to attacks. So that's one way for Iran to respond, obviously then inviting further strikes by the U.S. Another way that Iran can retaliate is closing the Strait of Hormuz, where 20% of global oil supply passes through. Today, the Iranian parliament voted for that, even though it's not binding, but it's a symbolic gesture representing, what the hardliners are asking for. That's one of the things Iran can do. And also, as a last resort, Iran can attempt to really destroy oil infrastructure in the region, in those countries where U.S. has military bases. And I think that's one of the worst case scenarios that people are contemplating.
OK, and Gary O'Donoghue, just very briefly, we've only got a few minutes left, and I want to leave the last word with John Simpson, if I can. But Gary, what are the US options now if there is not a negotiated settlement? Because we've heard that this was a very focused operation and Trump is clearly hoping for some sort of deal still, but that might not happen imminently.
Yeah, I don't think they're very optimistic about that happening anytime soon. They will hope that last night dealt a significant blow. Their briefing this morning was very, very short on any proof of that. Lots and lots of rhetoric, but not a single image or picture or piece of evidence to prove that. The other thing I'd say is in terms of retaliation, don't forget there have been some foiled plots here which have been Iranian backed in the United States Some of them a little bit haphazard, some of them not so much. So there are potential types of retaliation that could come very, very close to home for the United States, and that could be a real threat to the regime, because an attack on the homeland, on the home soil here, however it gets done, would be a significant blow to the Trump regime. So they, I think, will be trying to work the back channels in the coming days, as they've been doing. Okay. They've been trying to get the negotiations back again and really present to the Iranians that there is now no longer any choice apart from to talk.
And John Simpson, if I can just bring you in, just to sum up where we are, again, in a way where we started, how worried should we all be by what's happened? Some people will see this as reassuring, but how do you think this is going to play out in the next few hours and days?
Well, I'd like to make 2 points about this. One is that we shouldn't overestimate Iran's strengths or its abilities. Yes, of course, it can do asymmetrical attacks, and there's not a fantastic amount that can be done to stop that. But that is limited. It's small time. It's not population threatening, as it were. So we shouldn't be too scared, I think, about Iran's likely retaliation. But there are all sorts of other things. I mean, I feel that last night was a big change, a major turn of the page. And in one particular respect, I think it's downhill for President Trump from now on. He's losing the support of the isolationists among the MAGA supporters, of whom there are a large, if not dominant, amount. He's done something which he promised he wouldn't do, and he's moving against that. And I think we'll find that his power will start to diminish after this. Okay.
John Simpson, thank you very much indeed. Our World Affairs editor, Mark Lone in Tel Aviv, Gary O'Donoghue in Washington, Mikey Kay here with me in the studio, Lyse Doucet and Siavash Ardalan. Thank you all very much indeed for being with us. And thank you all for sending in your questions. And of course, we are going to continue to do these special sessions. But thank you all very much for being with us. I'm Geetha Gurumuthy. This is BBC News.